The best way to describe Incremental Factory is what would happen if an incremental game and Factorio had a baby. Which I guess explains the name of the game. Most of you on the channel will probably know what Factorio is, or at least what a factory game is, but you might not know what an incremental game is. The most famous example of an incremental game probably is Cookie Clicker. You start off by clicking a bit and getting some cookies for that, but soon after that you're going to build some buildings to make cookies by themselves. You then use all of these cookies to get more buildings that produce cookies, and you rinse and repeat that until you get a zillion amount of cookies. It's all about scaling up to get even bigger numbers. And honestly, on paper, that sounds really boring. Until you're actually playing a game like that, and then 3 hours in you realize that you're late for an appointment because you really just needed to add in that last upgrade 2 hours ago. So you're warned, this particular genre is very addicting. Now, there's been hundreds of incremental games like that over the past years, but all of them follow the basic same formula, with varying degrees of success. Incremental Factory, on the other hand, is a little bit different from most of those type of games that I've played, and since I really like incremental games, I've played a lot of them. In this game, you again start out by manually clicking a few times to get some basic things like coal and iron, but then you start building mines to do that for you. You then add some more mines and smelters to automate making those materials so you can build even more mines and smelters. So far, the pretty typical incremental stuff. However, where this game diverges from the typical incremental game strategy is that you actually have to set up production lines and direct your products across those lines. Items don't just go into some magical inventory that you can just use anywhere, nope. You'll actually have to build dedicated warehouses to store them. You can also only build a limited amount of warehouses, so you actually need to think about how you set up your production lines and what should go into them where. These production lines are also split across dedicated sections of your factory called parcels. Each parcel can only contain a limited amount of buildings and can only connect to a limited amount of other parcels. On top of that, the connections between these parcels act like belts that have a limited speed, and each connection can only transport a single item. This means that in order to ensure you're not wasting production and still get things to go where they actually need to go, the factory builder part of this game really starts kicking into gear. To make matters a little bit more interesting still, there's also a few different types of parcel, although there's not that many of them, but still. You have a production parcel that serves as the core of your factory, and this parcel holds the most buildings, but it doesn't provide any other boost than that. You also have the extraction parcel that boosts mines, but that only connects to a small amount of other parcels. And then, last but not least, you have nodes, which have a very high connection speed and a high number of possible connections, but you can't actually hold any buildings in those parcels themselves, so you really need to use them in order to interconnect the rest of your factory. The result of all of this is that instead of mindlessly building and scaling up your factory like you would in most incremental games, you actually need to think a little bit about ratios, layouts, and priorities of resources. As your factory grows larger, things do actually become more expensive as well, and that means you do actually need to scale up your factory in order to keep items flowing in at a steady rate, but you cannot just spam buildings in order to do that. And then to make matters even more complex, there is a technology tree that unlocks not just new materials and buildings, but also lets you increase your base production rates and transport speeds. Now, normally this would be very straightforward, but there's also limits on how many materials you can mine, so the base resources. After a certain point, adding more mines still increases your production, but it also comes at a bit of a cost to all your existing mines, which may throw off the initial balancing you had before, making you revisit your earlier builds. Finally, there is a separate part of the game that is basically a tower defense, where you need to protect your core facility against the waves of enemies. Now, I have to admit, initially I found this addition a little bit weird, especially since the first waves of enemies are very easy to defend against. But actually later on it became clear to me that this is meant to force you to build up your factory and your production speeds in order to, well, basically bottleneck your production. The turrets you can build to defend your base are very expensive and become even more expensive as you build more of them, quickly becoming the main bottleneck to your progress, especially in the late game. However, the unlocks that you get from actually defeating these waves are very, very rewarding and very valuable. For example, you can actually increase the game speed, thereby basically increasing your production rates without adding any additional buildings to your factory. On top of that, it can actually raise the cap on your mine production. So even though as you build more mines, the production rates of each individual mine goes down, there is a bottom limit that is set. So there is always going to be a certain amount of new materials coming out of every mine you build. And you can increase that further by unlocking more waves in this tower defense minigame. On top of that, there are certain resources locked behind this game as well. So that basically means that you need to play this game in order to progress through the next tiers of the technology tree. All of this combines to a pretty straightforward but also oddly addicting gameplay. Even every time I thought that I kind of figured out the game and I was just a few copy pastes away from just power gaming my way through it, the game threw another complication my way that I needed to solve in order to continue, which is actually a good thing. As you scale up and production chains become more complicated, you really do not want to manually have to recreate every production line several times. Luckily, the game comes with a copy-paste function that allows you to simply replicate areas of your factory. Keep in mind that mindlessly copy-pasting areas will actually slow things down, so you do need to keep thinking about what you do where. On top of that, the copy-pasting is not instant. The buildings actually still need to be built, and you kind of have these drones that you don't actually see, but they will kind of keep buildings in the background, even if you go and do something else. Now, the speed of those drones is actually not going to be enough once you start out really scaling up a large part of your factories. I've had situations where I had, I think, more than 5,000 buildings queued up. So once the drones only start out building something like 120 buildings per minute initially, you really want to scale that up. Luckily, you can, but you have to again build a production line in order to do that. Now, you've been looking at this for a little while now already, but as you can see in terms of graphics, the game is not much to look at. It basically feels and looks like you're playing around with a flowchart generator powered by Excel or something like that. However, as someone who has made an Excel spreadsheet for pretty much half the games I've played in my life, that's probably not necessarily a bad thing. I do realize, however, that it won't appeal to everyone. Keep in mind that the flowchart elements to this game actually do make it very easy to identify what is being produced where, and the colors actually let you know which pipelines are saturated, which ones are not, and stuff like that. So it's actually really well done and vital to the gameplay, as long as, of course, as you ensure that you keep things nice and tidy so you can actually tell what's going on. Now, I do want to note that this is an indie game and it is in early access, and, well, you can tell. It is definitely a little rough around the edges here and there, and for example, the copy-pasting ability sometimes bugged out on me. A simple reload then fixed that issue, but it occurred with a high enough frequency to annoy me at times. I also had some issues with the turrets not being removed or placed properly, and late game, the optimization seems to need some work as well, because it was clear my FPS was dropping due to the CPU struggling to keep up. Now, this is common in factory games, but I didn't really expect it from a more simplistic game like this. So once again, I do want to make sure you get this warning that this is not a completely finished or streamlined game just yet. In terms of the length of this game, I was able to complete this game in under 20 hours with pretty active playing. Similar to other incremental games, however, this is a game that doesn't really need your attention all the time. I mean, don't tell your boss I said this, but it's a great game to have on the side while working, for example. For example, duplicating a large section of your factory can easily take a few minutes, even though it's automated for the most part, so it's perfect to have that built while you're sitting in a long dreary meeting. Same holds for certain parts where you need to buy an expensive turret for your defense. You might need to just sit around and wait a few minutes for those materials together, so you could either use that to continue building your factory or just go and do something else and come back once those resources are there. All in all, I will be the first to say that this game is not going to appeal to everyone, but I did in fact enjoy playing it myself, so it definitely gets a positive recommendation from me. It's not extremely long, but it's also priced reasonably and still in active development, so even though you buy it now, you might get more out of it later as well, and it's a pretty easy game to replay if this is the type of game you like. I'll actually link to the Steam page in the description below in case you want to check it out for yourself. I hope you found this review useful. If you did, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more if you want. And let me know in the comments if you decide to pick this game up or if you have any further questions about it. If you're still here, you are awesome, and I do hope to catch you in the next one.